Okay. There we go. Okay, so good morning and welcome everyone to our first session of the second day of our conference, The Middle Ages as a Digital Experience. I'm Juan Manuel Rubio, I'm one of the organizers of the event, and I want to welcome you to this panel called Creating and Designing Medieval Digital Experiences. It's going to be a very interesting panel because we're going to be looking at games from the designing point of view, which is normally a point of view that we don't get much in these academic spaces. As few instructions before we begin, please remember that you cannot unmute yourselves. We will unmute you during the Q&A. Each one of our panelists, Acer Lewis, Mohammed Abdul Karim, and James Bailie, will have each of them 20 minutes to present their paper in that particular order. So first we're going to have Acer, then we're going to have Mohammed, and then we're going to close with James. Each one of you has 20 minutes. We will have questions at the end, and that's pretty much it. So now I would like to give the session to Zsuzsa Reed, who is one of our professors here at the Department of Medieval Studies, and who is going to be chairing this session. Zsuzsa is a medievalist, book historian, and literary scholar. She received MAs from Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest and Central European University, and a PhD in medieval studies in 2010 from the University of Leeds. As a medievalist, she has taught courses in textual and manuscript studies, as well as medieval cartography, and supervised a number of MA theses. In addition, she has been supporting academic writing, thesis writing, and research methods in the Department of Medieval Studies, History and Cultural Heritage since 2014. Her research focuses on various aspects of historiography and history writing, book history, textual transmission, and the textual and materials aspects of knowledge transfer in the Middle Ages and early modern era, primarily working with sources in Latin and Middle English. So Zsuzsa, it's a pleasure to have you here in our panel, and you can take it from there.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm absolutely privileged and honored to be here. It's very exciting for me. As you may have noticed, I'm a medievalist dealing with very different sources and not really games, but I'm very, very interested in creating spaces, in creating chronicle worlds and worlds in general in literature. So that's the angle I'm coming from. And much about me. Let's go for the first presenter. We have Acer Lewis here, who is a recent graduate at Central European University, and Acer's research focuses on the interplay in the culture of 18th century Habsburg Europe between constructed civility and the state on one hand, and imagined wildness and the borderlands on the other. It's fascinating. So his current projects focus on the perception of landscape produced by the late 18th century topographic mapping of Central and Southeast Europe. And we're going to hear about maps in medieval video games. Thank you, Acer. So you have 20 minutes.
Great. Shall I just jump into it then?
Please do, yes.
Okay. So the paper that I've written is entitled From Map Painting to Unmapping Perception, Problems and Solutions in the Psychology of Medieval Game Design. And I have to apologize, my voice is a little bit messed up this morning for some reason. Right. Let me see how I can operate this. So, when you press the keyboard letter M in almost any video game, a nearly universal feature is triggered. A map of some form flashes onto the screen, depicting the player's location within a 2D representation of the game world. Often, it is a critical gameplay mechanic, reminding the absent-minded player of where they must go and what they must do. But in other cases, especially in strategy games, the map is the platform of the game itself. It's both a representation of space and the object of gameplay competition. And while this is seemingly mundane, maps as gameplay mechanics are enormously important because the ways we perceive the world around us condition our behavior toward it. In the context of historical games aiming to authentically depict the pre-modern world, maps are not only anachronistic, but tend to produce a problematic and distinctly modern set of player behaviors, most notably map painting. This is a gameplay mechanic characterized by a material exploitative competition in which the player is consciously or unconsciously driven to expand across, discover, and conquer the game landscape embodied in the map. Besides being reductive and one-dimensional, it naturally neglects the wide variety of symbolic, ritual, and cultural ways that historical people have seen and engaged with space. Game developers recognize this fact and have begun over the past decade to develop history-focused games set in the medieval period with increasingly restrictive gameplay mechanics to combat map painting and encourage a more dynamic and narrative-driven gameplay. This essay begins by briefly summarizing theoretical problems of maps for landscape perception, illustrated by a contrast between navigating and wayfinding. I then examine a number of case studies of games in dialogue with their maps, from those based explicitly on map conquest to several which attempt to disempower their maps, and finally to one game which explicitly removes its game to facilitate a more historicized, complex player engagement with its game world. This approach is intended to connect differing modes of depicting the landscape in games with the corresponding effects on player behavior. This suggests that viewing the landscape from a medieval perspective without a map is not just about historical accuracy, doesn't just make it more historically accurate, but it actually results in a completely different worldview. It results in a much more appreciative and perhaps even healthy relationship with the world. It is perhaps surprising to most people, given the normality of maps in daily life, that maps as tools for conceptualizing locations and objects in space are a distinctly modern practice. While maps have been made since ancient times, with just a few examples, these were either heavily abstracted, meaning depicting only the names of cities and settlements in a roughly geographic configuration, or focused exclusively on coastlines at the expense of terrestrial space. The first topographical maps depicting landscapes in a standardized way were not made until the mid to late 18th century, and these seem not to have been published widely until much later. Prior to this, and this is an extremely late point when you think about the stream of human history. Prior to this point, the vast majority of humanity likely imagined the landscape without reference to a map as we know it. By contrast, today, the representation of space has become so saturated by this singular depictive mode that we almost invariably imagine space according to a Google Maps perspective, top-down, oriented by the cardinal directions, exclusively visual and fixed in time, and according to a mode that is universally replicable anywhere in the world. As I have argued previously in previous papers, this unique way of envisioning space is closely linked with an imperialistic and materialistic portrayal of the natural landscape as an object for human improvement and exploitation. I suspect that many of the ways of imagining space we now label as folkloric or indigenous are simply variants of perspectives common in the pre-modern past, before the West became West. So, how was space viewed before the map? Tim Ingold provides an in-depth analysis of this topic in his collection of essays, The Perception of the Environment, Essays in Livelihood, Dwelling, and Skill, in which he contrasts the concepts of navigation using a map with the practice of moving through the world, which he labels wayfinding. Quotes. When navigating in a strange country by means of a topographic map, the relation between one's position on the ground and one's location in space is defined by a particular map coordinates is strictly synchronic and divorced from any narrative context. It is possible to specify where one is, one's current location, without regard to where one has been or where one is going. In the framework of navigating, meaning moving from point A to point B on a map, signs and senses of the world bear no value or meaning. The navigator must ignore them in the same way that an ocean liner plows through waves and wind. By contrast, wayfinding for Ingold is a mode of finding one's way through space using improvisation, the memories of past experiences, and an ability to feel the environment. If the navigator is like an ocean liner, the wayfinder is like a Micronesian seafarer, informed by wind and waves, the movement of stars, and the memories of voyages learned and taken. This distinction is not merely about how people travel through space. It also emphasizes a relationally different understanding of the world around us. So while the navigator armed with a map is able to freely disregard everything that is not an obstacle or an immediate danger, the wayfinder exists in a world where every place within, and this is quotes, every place holds within it memories of previous arrivals and departures, as well as the expectations of how one may reach it or reach other places from it. Thus do places enfold the passage of time, endlessly generated through the comings and goings of their inhabitants. They figure not as locations in space, but as specific vortices in a current of movement, of innumerable journeys actually made. So this is by no means a complete summary of a long list of theoretical objections to MAP. This is one objection. And I should mention that the maps have been implicated in a long list of terrible accusations as forces of the modern state in not extending its panoptic vision, as forces of rhetoric for the technical supremacy of modern science. But in this paper, I wanted to highlight a hitherto hardly recognized effect of map using upon the perception of the landscape. In the following sections, I attempt to show how the incorporation of maps into video games, regardless of genre, produces an implicit parallel or metagame in which expanding across and mastering the map supersedes all other gameplay aims. The most extreme example of this almost certainly is demonstrated by the Total War series of strategy games. And I won't include a complete list because they have produced like 8 or 9 medieval games set in the medieval period, which you probably all know. But the first game in this series, Shogun Total War, began in its development as a set of standalone battles where the player acting as a general commanded units to move around a battlefield and fight. However, as Mike Simpson, the development manager at the time, describes, the one-off battles ultimately left nothing much to make you care about the results in the long run. So to solve this, the studio developed a parallel game map, which puts a wrapper around these battles to give the game a long-term metagame. This made the gameplay more compelling, in that the battlefield competition became reliant upon decisions made at a strategic level upon the map. Yet it also dramatically simplified the object of competition at the core of the game. While role-playing a general and inventing battlefield tactics remains the main appeal of the series, the actual gameplay is mostly conducted upon a zero-sum campaign map in which the only way to win is to paint the world in your faction's color. Now, can you guys all see the backgrounds behind me? I'm not sure if it's showing very well. Well, you can't tell me anyways. Right.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, good. Resultingly, all other concerns fade away. Diplomacy with other factions, character stories, and faction differences all reduce to minor mechanics and optional features. So, against this reductive metagaming, the role-playing strategy game Crusader Kings presents a case study of game developers working to disempower the map even as they employ it as the basis of the game world. And I won't describe the game because I'm sure you all already know it. We're all gamers here, I think. The game map is the foundation of the game. But in contrast to the Total War model, the developers of Crusader Kings instituted a dynastic inheritance system in which continued control over the landscape is unstable and beholden to familial and political relationships. The game thus actively challenges the psychological inclination to conquer the landscape, although it maintains a map metagame and rewards the conquest with achievements on the Steam platform. The resulting effect is a mixed bag. Character development and life stories are at the core of the gameplay, yet the ultimate objective is still to master the map. And before continuing to the third case study of this essay, it is worth observing how these map-based games present the landscape of the medieval world. The player exists not within the worlds, but above them, looking down upon a flat and desensitized game board from an imagined perspective on high. In these perspectives, in these representations, all is silent, all is still and silent. There is neither sunlight nor moonlight. There are no variations of light nor shade, nor clouds, no shadows nor reflections. The wind does not blow, neither disturbing the trees nor whipping water into waves. No birds fly in the sky or sing in the woods. Forests and pastures are devoid of animal life. As Tim Ingold reminds us, these things are the stuff of life itself. Depicting the world stripped of sensate experience perversely alters the behavior of players, reducing the game into a competition over abstract space from which resources are extracted in order to fuel the furtherance of conflict. In short, the game map psychologically enables role-playing as a modern state. For a final example, from the opposite side of the mapping spectrum, consider the first-person role-playing game, Kingdom Come Deliverance. This remarkable production consciously strives to situate its gameplay experience in a synchronic reproduction of a real landscape, a region of southern Bohemia in the year 1403. In the normal difficulty setting of the game, it features a normal toggleable topographic map rendered as a hand-painted image reminiscent of medieval European art. And you can see in this picture, in this little red guy down below is your location. It automatically tells you where it is, where you are. However, when set to hardcore mode, the player is no longer automatically shown their location on the map and can no longer fast travel or automatically move from one location to another. This means that moving around the game world actually requires engaging with the landscape, observing landmarks, becoming aware of the direction of the sun at different times of day, and making educated guesses about the correct paths to take. While the continued presence of a map means that exploring is still fundamentally a process of unlocking new locations and regions, the activity of moving through the space becomes much more like wayfaring and much less like navigating. Not coincidentally, narrative rather than map mastery constitutes the unquestionable core gameplay experience. In conclusion, maps are an especially important educational tool for understanding perception due to their ability to facilitate an embodied experience of the past. As one poster on a Kingdom Come Deliverance internet forum writes, "I find it extremely frustrating. Eventually, by exploring, you learn where stuff is by looking at the landmarks and landscape. Guess this is exactly how it was back then. Yet this is more than just about presenting the past correctly. By incorporating theoretical observations about human spatial perception into their development, games have the power to make us change how we think about space and how we behave in the real world, perhaps. We are currently living through an ecological crisis, a crisis which I suggest is the direct result of a psychology of material exploitative competition inherent to capitalism. Thus, it is quite important to recognize that the in-game map in a total war game reproduces this exact psychology of competition, whereas a player in a game like Kingdom Come Deliverance relies upon the landscape and lives within it. Unmapping video games won't fix our world, but they might have a role in expanding awareness of historicized and more experiential alternative ways of perceiving it. I've finished.
Thank you for the excellent timekeeping. Thank you very much. I'm asking Juan Manuel, are we going on to our second speaker?
Yeah, we will have the Q&A
Okay.
at the end.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, just wanted to double check. Okay, thank you very much, Acer, for this wonderful presentation. And as far as I know, the next paper is by Mohammed Abdul Karim, who's with us. So yes, I can see you. So Mohammed is a game director of Sankala Dev, which is an indie game developer from Indonesia. And they focus on historical strategy game. He founded Sankala Dev in 2015. And he has a bachelor's degree from the Department of History in Indonesia's university, and is interested in maritime and video game. Okay? And he's also a creator of Perang, Laut Maritime Warfare, Dato of Srivijaya, and Surabaya Inferno. And now he's focusing his research about press in the New Order of 1990s, and is preparing a new project in Sankala as well. And I'm sorry about butchering these names. My pronunciation was probably not the best, but I'll give the floor to Mohammed, so you hear the real deal, and you have 20 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the short presentation of my biography. So I will present about my presentation about producing Glory of Srivijaya in Dato of Srivijaya. So this is actually a postmortem of Dato of Srivijaya, the game I made in 2 years ago. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what is Dato of Srivijaya? Is the genre of Dato of Srivijaya is strategy and historical game. The studio is Game Sankala Dev, and the engine is Game Maker Studio. If you have heard Game Maker Studio, I use a Game Maker Studio 1.4. It's released 2 years ago. Next slide. So this is a screenshot of that of Srivijaya, the map. Next slide. Okay. Next slide. Next cell. Okay, next slide. So before I telling what is that of Srivijaya, I will highlight the history of Srivijaya. So if you unaware about the history of Southeast Asia, Srivijaya is one of big empire in Southeast Asia. At 7th century in South Sumatra, this empire established around 7th century at South Sumatra, and become an important place for studying Buddhist in Asia. As a Chinese monk said I Ching in a 1671 year. There are reports about Srivijaya campaigns at 687 to 686, report in the Tukan Bukit inscription, and many inscription in around Sumatra. Neighbor of Srivijaya, like Jambi and Bangka Islands, has conquered, and Srivijaya preparing invasion to Java. After that, Srivijaya become an important maritime site in Asia, from sea trading, Buddhist study beside India, and Navy empire in Asia. Around 6 to 10th century, they are Sailendra dynasty between Srivijaya, Angkor, and Java. But after the destruction of the Sailendra dynasty, the rivalry between Srivijaya and Java, the Mataram Empire, continue with destruction of Srivijaya in later time. Next slide. So this is high click of Srivijaya, the Srivijaya area. Next slide. And this is Srivijaya and Buddhist learning in Asia. If you see in Sumatra, there are Srivijaya area at there. Next. So this is the destruction of Srivijaya. Destruction of Srivijaya start in early 11th century era when the Chola Empire from India invaded Srivijaya twice. Because Chola trader disrupt from the Srivijaya policy. This is made Rajendra Chola invade Srivijaya. From after that, Srivijaya Empire become more weaker as a Japanese empire, like controlling a Strait of Malacca, and this empire ended in 14th century. After that, the Srivijaya legacy continued by Sultanate of Malacca. But the name of Srivijaya and the story of glory of Srivijaya has mixed with many myths in Sumatra and Malaya. So people from that time until 10th century, the information of Srivijaya mixed with many myths from Alexander the Great and Islam legend. Until 20th century, unlike the Java, in Java there are many stories about the past kingdom like Majapahit. They are still continue in local chronicle like called Babat and Papat Shadow and Wayang. Well, in Sumatra, the influence of Java mixed with their might. So basically, people in Sumatra do not have to know what is Srivijaya. Next. Next slide. So in 1980, the George Coyce, the French archaeologist, published the paper of Srivijaya. Srivijaya. Dutch archaeologist called the Srivijaya is name of king, but George Coyce tell it is not. Srivijaya is the name of empire, and he proved that Srivijaya extension with his many papers. And from that time, this Coyce research very important for people who are learning about Srivijaya. So the Coyce research very impact how Indonesia could know. There are another great kingdom besides Java in Sumatra called Srivijaya and influenced the Indonesian nationalism and Sumatra pride. In Sumatra, they are heavily influenced by Java, but with now they are now this is Srivijaya. So they proud about their past, but the glory of Srivijaya more great from Java. From many decades, there are many research contribute in history of Srivijaya. Beside the inscription, like a Chinese and Indian literature, the ruins outside Indonesia, like in Thailand and Malay, and letters, the letters from the Srivijaya emperor to another king in Asia. Next slide. So this is preparation from my production. In August 2018, I became speaker in a Srivijaya seminar in Palembang when the Director General of Culture celebrating the 100 years discovery of Srivijaya. And at there, I learned many things about Srivijaya. The idea of Srivijaya comes from my previous projects, Perang Laut Maritime Warfare, in August 2019, but it's postponed well of my spirit. Next slide. So this is a picture when I attend in seminar and become speaker at there. Next slide. And this all prototype when I try to make a Dato of Srivijaya in 3 years ago. Next slide. So this before this is preparation for my production. Since 6 years ago, Sankaladev manifest many problems from experience and funding. In late 2009, in this around late November, I met with the people in the director of history in Ministry of Education and Culture and present my projects. They tell me about funding of their funding, and which called Facilitate Culture Project in next years. In early March 2020, I got more information about this, and I learned about Facilitate Culture Project. Next slide. So what is Facilitate Culture Projects? This project is the result of a cultural congress in December 2018 to make immortal found in Indonesia culture development. 2020 is the first day of these projects. They are divided in 2 phases, March and July in their registration. When I know that this first phase is already ended, and I must wait into July to register. There are 3 categories in this project, and one is creative innovation, which I suspect the game can add registration in this project. This maximum proposal found is 1 billion rupiah, around 70,000 USD. Next slide. So I submit my idea in the middle July when they open the 2 last phase. I got news in email. I must submit my full proposal in middle August, and in 1 month later, they visit my studio.
Mohammed, I think, I don't know if it's only me, but
to replicate my extension. And in last September, I got news I must attend in a workshop, which I finalized my budget about around 1 million, around 100,000. Next slide.
Are you still there, Mohammed?
We lost Mohammed.
Yeah, it gives me the impression. Yeah, can the rest of maybe of the audience hear him?
No, it's completely gone. I think it's not the sound
We
anymore.
lost him.
Yeah.
I mean, well, let's wait maybe a couple of minutes so maybe he can reconnect. There he is. Okay, give me a minute.
Sorry.
Are you there?
Yes. There are
Okay.
connection problem.
Okay, so give me a moment. I'm going to show your presentation again.
Sorry. Connection problem.
Okay, there you go.
Okay, thank you. So, so after I got my found, I consolidate my project teams and write the engine voice scripts based on inscription and engine text I got found in Wikipedia and from my books. I am also searching the voice actors from my connection, ancient Malay, Sunda, and Japanese. And I asked to my composer to make a suitable music for Srivijaya era and do research and consulted with some expert. On next slide. So this is a production from my voice actors and my composer. Next slide. This is the draft of my illustration. Next slide. This is Dato of Srivijaya in 2 years ago. Next. Okay. The problems. Making a voice script is taking more longer than I was thinking about before. Voice script, especially in Japanese and Sundanese, I take more longer than I thought because there are no at first time I think it's more easier than, but when I write it, it's very hard to make the script, especially not many people can write it, especially a Malay vocabulary. There are no vocabulary for ancient Malay from what I got from the archaeologists. So I write it from the inscription, and there are more problems. The voice actors from ancient Malay withdraw twice. So I write the Malay scripts in modern Malay, so they can speak it. The problem is they cannot pronounce ancient Malay. They pronounce modern Malay, so they use a Malay, modern Malay words. Unlike Sundanese and Japanese, the voice actor still can pronounce it, especially for the Japanese voice actor. He can pronounce the ancient Japanese, which very different from the modern Japanese. And there are mismanagement of production and experienced team members. Freelancer led to submit the draft, and bad game design. As you can see, the previous game design is more bad than newer version. And there are another problems. Traditional music for Khmer and Champa. Khmer and Champa is a kingdom in Indochina, and we never heard about traditional music from there. Also for a composer, but luckily I got connection from in Phnom Penh in Cambodia. She gave me how like the Khmer and the Champa music like. The composer learned how about the music, and he made the Khmer and the Champa music. Isn't maybe if you have heard from the civilization music from Khmer, and they're like the music same have similarity. The next, the production it take more longer than I think. The schedule only 1 month, 1.5 months, nearly 2 months. It's very hard to me to make the game stable version, and there are lack of information in several earlier in 7th century. I need read many books about Srivijaya at that time, and it's very challenging. Next, the interview in middle November. I access from representation the Director General of Culture. I can join interview about their projects in 10 November 2020. I another selected projects with the Director General of Culture talking about this project and how our experience in this project in national television in Zoom meeting. Next. This is when I got presenting my project in national television. Next. Risk and problem. As you know, there are problems before, and we must release it as soon as possible since they are our deadline. So we release it in 15 December 2020 with unstable version, and 1 week later we update this game and update it in February 2021. We with playabiling Kingdom of Sunda and Mataram. There are many negative factors. With these many problems, we have get bad reputation from this game. in Steam, and this make why this game not much get attention from Indonesian. Okay, next. Okay, this is the screenshot of the of Srivijaya in Steam. Next. So what's next? After release the last update in March 2020, Sengkala Dev has realized there are many spaces from history of Srivijaya and Southeast Asia in 17th century and to 10th century for next update. This game is free from everyone, free to play, and there are big possible so us to have long-term game development in this game. This is we want to make this game more to understanding people, new people to understanding Sengkala games, especially for Srivijaya, history of Srivijaya. Not much developers see the Srivijaya games, history of Srivijaya, especially for strategy games. Next. Thank you from my short presentation. I'm sorry for my problems in pronunciation and other many problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed, very much for this fascinating presentation. I'm sure you have you'll have a good discussion with Acer. There's a lot of overlaps between the two presentations, as far as I can see. And now we can go straight on to James's presentation, who is going to talk about the making of a princely man, programming a medieval society. So after maps, we're going to focus on the ground. And just a couple of words about you, James. James is a PhD student at the University of Vienna right now, specializing in digital humanities, prosopographical methods, and the history of high medieval Caucasus. In addition to this core research, he has a strong interest in games, particularly game mechanics and code as historical models and ways of transmitting information about the past. As well as teaching and writing on the subject, he's a convener of Coding Medieval Worlds workshop series, which brings together historians and game developers to discuss shared challenges. And outside academia, he develops his own computer games and other creative works, and is the chair of game development and creative projects community Auxilium. So I think I give the floor to James now. And there it is. There's the slide making of a princely man.
All visible. Good. I just hang on, just check. Is that's moving slides going okay as well? Good. Right. So yeah, this is going to be a bit of an odd talk for me because I'm sort of actually wearing my developer hat as much as my historian hat for once, as I'm going to be talking you through some of the work I've done on a game that I've been developing for the last few years. The title of the talk actually comes from one of the media pieces I created within the sort of game's implied setting, which is a sort of traditional folk song style thing about essentially making up a quote ideal prince out of random stuff you find around the place, which you'll see why that's sort of on theme as we go through this. So a few things to kind of bear in mind about how I think about this stuff as we go through the rest of the talk. I think firstly, I kind of want to focus on the idea of game medievalisms as curating bits of the past, rather than thinking about this from an accuracy perspective. I think the problem with accuracy is that ultimately, as a whole, a game is never accurate. And indeed, what I'm going to be talking about is mostly fantastical. But the question of what are we putting in, what are we taking from the past using in our game, and why are we doing that? And what are we leaving behind, I think is a more interesting framing to bear in mind as one looks at these things. And the other thing I'm going to be talking about a bit is code. As historians, we tend to focus quite easily on narrative and aesthetics. What is medieval in this? Where is medieval in this? Who is medieval in this? The thing about code that makes it so important for player experience is that it is what defines how people act in a medieval game world and why they do what they do. And those understandings of people's expectations of a society are in many ways more important for giving them an impression of the kind of world they're in. And some of these are questions that are awkward for us as historians. There are questions that if you ask me to, answer them based on the source material from my period, I would flat out tell you, we just don't have the material to answer that question. But if I'm building a game, I can't not answer that question. That's not an option that's on the table for me. So in that sense, there are areas where we have to be almost willing to push our boundaries a bit as historians to try and transfer some of our knowledge interestingly into a game setting. So the Exile Prince is the game I'm going to be talking about. It's what I think of as a warband style role-playing game. So you have a single central character. You build up a party of followers, but it's not just a sort of small party of companions. You can also have some sort of troops, or in some cases hedgehogs, with you as you wander around the map. And the progression of the game ultimately is about you building up sort of authority and power. It is very much in its sort of win conditions one of these fairly zero sum, you take over the different cities that you find around the map. There are various ways of doing that. It's turn-based, and it is very heavily procedurally generated. So there are maps, characters, locations, and quests that are all produced afresh at the start of every new game you play. And this is an idea of what it looks like. This is not exactly AAA stuff. It's clunky, and I built it myself, but this is an example of that. You wander around the map. You also have these continuous readouts going on of some text, which gives you some of this narration that can provide sometimes it's useful detail, sometimes it is just that sort of landscape feel that you kind of want the player to have, despite having this kind of, as Acer was saying, flat representation. Similarly, there's this sort of fairly simplified turn-based battle system. So it's very fantastical. I mean, as you can see, there's dragons and wizards and all that going on here. I think it's very tempting to have the idea that fantastical precludes medieval. I don't think it actually does at all. I think there are plenty of fantasy games out there that are more medieval in some ways than, say, something like Kingdom Come Deliverance, which sells itself super hard on the, we've got the look right, we've got the swords right, but the social history from a medievalist perspective is bunk. So I think that it's important to have that in mind and think about the different things that can be medieval. And in this case, I'm partly playing with medieval imaginaries. I'm using actual manuscript images. I'm often using bits of random information pulled out of bestiaries when I'm creating some of these monsters to fight and so on. And I'm trying to put together a society that shows sort of personal bonds as important. And it's quite a heavily city-driven world, and in some ways that's an unmedieval thing if you're used to a very Western European perspective of a sort of heavily ruralized, castle-driven society. But at the same time, I'm trying not to make my imaginary of the medieval world for this game a very solely Western European thing. I mean, I'm a Caucasiologist. The sort of Near East is much more the area that I often have in mind with this stuff, where things actually are very driven around, control of and sometimes internal politics in particular cities. And it's that sort of medieval world that this game reflects. So when building these games, I think one important thing to bear in mind is that you can't do everything. And one of the big things really quite early on in a game building process is deciding what you're not going to do. So for example, in this, the battle system is quite simple. It means I can't have physical and tactical mechanics. I can't really have a stealth mission in this system. It doesn't work. I can't have sort of detailed moving around on a map tactics. Also, all of the decisions in the game that the player makes more or less are binary. You're basically making yes/no decisions rather than having these sort of complex dialogue tree systems. And that limits some of the scope for social interactions. On the other hand, it makes the game, manageable for me to build, which is an obviously desirable feature. And to give you a bit of an idea of like a bit of code, I thought I'd focus a bit on characters for a lot of the rest of this talk and some of the data structures around them. So up at the top here, we have a brief interaction with one of your companion characters. This is a randomly generated companion. And down at the bottom, we have the data structure essentially that tells you who this person is. So she's called Unkel Raintreader. And you can see this list of written traits and these various numbers. So the numbers are sort of battle stats of various sorts. But the word traits are sort of more interesting. So we have things like cleric skills. So she's a priest, but she has these different traits like companion, jester, old money. I'll explain those in a minute. Herbalism, that's a skill she has. Alagalisi will be the city she comes from. She's got gender _5, which is she's female. Sexuality _1, she's exclusively interested in men. She then has these ROM disinterest tags. Again, I'll get onto those in a minute. But so that gives you an idea of like the sort of data structure we're actually talking about that underpins what a person is in this kind of game. How does all that end up working in practice? So as you progress through the game, we've got these routes to power. This is a sort of game problem in that like human societies tend to be quite static, but players need progression. So you end up kind of having to make main characters that are society breaking, which is quite weird when you're trying to also represent that society. So in this game, I've done those in relatively conventional game ways. You start as a sort of effectively a sort of landless knight type character. You are treated as being of a fairly middling social rank as far as everyone's concerned. You've got a faction that you belong to, which gives you some sort of setting structure and playstyle variation. And this is sort of part of what drives your game and how you particularly want to play through in that round. So these are the different factions you can start as. They're all kind of abstracted ideas with different sort of play styles behind them. So if you want to play a very military game, you play as the House of Generals. If you want to play a more exploration-focused game, you play as scholars, and so on and so forth. If you want to have battle chickens, you play as the House of the Phoenix. They have battle chickens. They're fun. Back to the... And then you meet these characters along the way, as we just saw. And you've seen what makes up that character under the bonnet, and particularly these trait lists. So we've got this 3-pillar system I've designed for traits of functional role, core persona, social role. So in Unkel's case, as we saw a couple of slides ago, her functional role is cleric skills. She is a cleric. That's the thing she does in your party. Her core personality is jester. That's why she tells you terrible puns all the time. Her social role is old money. That is to say, that's my sort of in-game tag for she's from a traditionally elite family, and some of the ways she reacts to you will be based on that, and some of the things she does will be based on that. And the challenge is making these work and fit together in various ways and how we use them. So this is partly how all the dialogues are driven. Dialogues are often just sort of readouts of this person tells you a thing rather than a very interactable system in this game. But the dialogues mix and match. So in Unkel's case, you get the old money set of dialogues where she'll make comments about, traditional family stuff, and the jester comments where she will also make bad puns all the time. there are some of these that cross over awkwardly, but the reason for having that sort of separation of social role and personality is so you don't have so many permutations and combinations problems that you then have to sort of deal with at the end. Traits also unlock events, and this is, I think, one of the interesting things about kind of societal development is that traits can be about what a character is capable of doing. They're a cleric, but they're also about what a character is willing to do. So, for example, in some of the game's sort of electoral and societal mechanics, if you have a character who has the ruthless trait, they will come up to you with different opportunities for what to do because they are willing to break the rules in ways that other characters are not. And I think thinking about this in sort of thing in terms of, how do medieval people act is a really important and useful thing for us to think about when we're thinking about medieval societies in games. We can also have shared tag systems to network people together. So, for example, back on the slide, she had a couple of these rom disinterest tags, which is to say that is a romantic disinterest tag where the game has checked, is this person interested in this person, and decided no, and then it tags both of them, so that's like permanently locked in as not a potential romance. There's also some shared tags for how she reacts to the player. The sort of player system has a bit more depth to the system I use for NPCs with each other. The player is literally still the center of the world in this. But yes, so having these sort of tag lists means that I can do kind of shared links and then build actual sort of secondary networks between characters, like friendship and enmity, with which, for example, that can be management within your party, but it can also have other effects at other points in the game. Sometimes this can be difficult to access because my data structures are actually a bit terrible, but I won't go into that in too much detail now. I've mentioned romance at a certain point. This is an area where I'm not trying to do like historical accuracy, quote unquote, that heavily. There is a separate modeling for attraction and romance. So the game will check whether people are attracted to each other as a sort of almost starting thing when they start interacting. But that doesn't determine whether they end up in a romance or not. The sort of And if for player romances, which aren't all the romances in the game, there is sort of opportunity-based system where, there is a certain chance that if one of your companion characters is interested in you, they will sort of end up talking to you about it at some point. There are male, female, and non-binary characters in the game. There is a sort of percentage bias in how those work. So if you are playing your character as like canonically not straight, you might find that there are slightly fewer choices of partner available, but like there is no gender bias generally. Like you're not going to be prevented from doing things because you're a woman or because you're not playing your character as straight. This is actually the sort of selection you get for your character's gender. It's a really odd thing to do, actually, trying to work out how to do some of these things visually, because you don't want to do the like, yes, this is the completely typical male person. So actually what I did was I got this medieval planetary chart, and it highlights the orbit of Venus if you pick female, Mars if you pick male, and just all the other ones if you pick to be a non-binary gendered character. So yeah, and then there's other aspects of political views. So NPCs have their sort of political views via this sort of social trait. Are they old money? Are they a sort of radical peasant revolutionary, whatever? The player views actually have more of this kind of political compass system, which I might not have done if I rethought it now. But the good thing about that, it sort of has you on a sort of pro-peasant to pro-nobility, pro-authority to pro-freedom, like two-axis thing. It makes it easy to model kind of shifting stances and provide the player with potentially awkward choices, because some choices shift you on both axes. So for example, you might have to do the like, what if the local peasant mob wants to like attack the local noble who is also dabbling in magic, who that is nominally the sort of oppressive person giving their taxes, but that's not actually why they're trying to lynch this person. And you might have to think about what you do in that circumstance. So you might have the pro-peasant but also pro-authority choice, or the pro, and so it can be it can provide some interesting decisions, but it does sort of limit the diversity of how it models your viewpoint. So you can't, for example, be, I'm really pro, having lots of foreigners turn up into my city, but really anti anybody doing any sort of magic ever. So those are just both considered and bundled in as pro-freedom type choices in this system. So again, it's sort of benefits but also limitations. And for wielding power, as you get later in the game, you start without a city. You're just wandering around the map. You do quests for other people. You eventually start getting opportunities, which will be handed to you by nobles or possibly mysterious cackling groups of witches, to declare war on cities or get involved in the city's politics. And when you take over a city, there's then a holding court mechanic. So I didn't want to go for a traditional strategy like you've got all the levers and all the numbers, because I think this makes it quite interesting from a medievalism perspective that you have this opportunistic power system. You get to do things in the game and you get a decent amount of choice over whether you take those things or not, but also you have to be a bit reactive as well. There is some limitation of your total agency to just strut across this world, because you have to wait for some opportunities to come up. And there are also other balances to get. You have limited influence over your allies, even other city leaders from your faction. But if you don't give cities to anyone else, then you end up losing your cities because they require you to keep holding court for you to retain your prestige. People, if you don't keep actually paying attention to your cities, then local opposition will grow. And with the sort of shared tag systems I mentioned, those kind of ally networks, I think, are going to have some potential in future versions of the game to make some of this kind of late game politics more interesting. So yeah, I think that sort of about wraps it up. So I think so the takeaways I kind of want people to have from this are, for data structures and code, these have a big effect on how people work. And that's the thing that we should probably think about more than we sometimes do in these discussions together as historians. And for building better social roles and ways of thinking about medieval societies, we need to think about things like networks and connections, particularly between non-player characters, and their potential utility. And I think that it would be good if we had, more discussions on how to model social roles and also social views. How are people thinking about the world and what do people think the world should be like, as ways of building, more in-depth interactions with medieval societies, even when they're viewed from a fairly fantastical perspective. And that's that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. So that's our 3 papers for today. Sorry about that. So I think it's time to go on to the questions. And I think I should say a couple of words, Juan, first, and then let everyone else chip in.
Yeah, so if you want to, again, so for the whole audience, if you want to ask questions, feel free to raise your hands, or if you feel better writing it in the chat, also you can do that and we will read it for you. If you have some questions, Shuja, we normally give the privilege of asking the first questions to the chair, and then we get the discussion from there.
It's more just an observation than a question, and fascination, really. Thank you for giving us a glimpse into what happens behind the scenes or behind the screens. It's not something that we're familiar with when we're playing. It was especially fascinating for me because I deal so much with creating worlds. I deal with creating worlds by medieval people, And what I found fascinating is that the concerns and the problems that Acer and Mohammed and James were talking about are pretty much the universal concerns that medieval creators of spaces and worlds have grappled with. And I think that gives, it makes your work very poignant in a way that you're struggling with this mimetic purpose of creating, or mimetic nature of creating these spaces. And I have to congratulate to the organizers as well, because I really enjoyed the way that there was this arch in this session, because Acer was talking about looking down on the big picture and the problems of creating worlds from high above and then going into the field, more like in southern Bohemia it was. And then we heard about history and education, which is the time element, which is the mediated time that we're dealing with when we're dealing with medieval games. So that was especially really well connected to what Acer started to talk about as well. And then we just dove into the social connections and the human traits that govern everything on the micro level of human society. So that was just a really nice arch to this whole series of papers. And just to go back to this mimetic situation here, is that we're creating these worlds that we exist in. I was just wondering, you know, those very famous literary kind of literary creations like Jorge Luis Borges or Lewis Carroll, who talked about these maps that are of the scale of a mile to a mile. So basically recreating the map to the scale of our universe to create accuracy, to create the utmost accuracy and represent our world with this precision. And I was thinking about how the player expectation, and this is, I think, for all of the presenters, so how the player expectation kind of plays into your work or your thinking about the design of the games when you ultimately have to simplify. On one hand, you have to simplify because of the coding or the problems that Mohammed was talking about, very real world problems, or the lack of knowledge, the absence of connection with this past world, etc., etc. Or there is the player expectation to have a full immersion project and historical accuracy and, you know, demanding the feel of the medieval, which I think is more anxiety inducing than relaxing. But so is this something that you have to factor in when you think about the coding and design, or when you're interpreting games that are already out there, this audience expectation to be part of the created reality?
I'll jump in first because
yes,
I love that you brought up Borges, and that's a fantastic sort of thought experiment. And because, and I don't know if this is answering quite, or it might be moving past the second half of your question, but so this is a story that of an empire in which the College of Cartographers has reached such perfection that they create a map of a city that's the size of a city, and then a region that's the size of the region, and then they have created a map where every it's a 1-to-1 ratio of portrayals of landscape to space, and then ultimately the landscape is filled with the detritus of all of this paper where animals live under it. But the idea with that, I think, is relevant because if you, the point that I wanted to bring up is it's not about, I mean, when you represent space, if you're using something like a map, which is a simplification, which is a flattening, it's translating reality into a two-dimensional plane, that is something that has inherent qualities which are, I think, negative. And so in the case of, even if you make a one-to-one map of the world, even if you were able to do that, or to create a game with a beyond a AAA studio, call it a quadruple A studio with a ridiculous amount of money, and to create a game that so perfectly mimics reality. If you're building that game in a certain way, using maybe a map, or in other cases, you still have these inherent issues that results in specific behaviors. That's my think piece.
Thank you very much, especially with the maps that you mentioned, Acer. It was, I also thought, like, is there a game, and excuse my ignorance, but is there a game that uses the fact that it doesn't have to be two-dimensional and flattened? Can you zoom in like in Prezi? Can you switch time? I mean, you can, in my mind, but is there a game that uses this? And I'm thinking of the Hereford Mappamundi, where there's time beautifully presented, history and time is narrated in a 2D situation. Then a game certainly can do even more than that. So that's, again, just a question of kind of, I'm not very familiar with games. I'm familiar with medieval maps.
Oh, I don't know. That's a very interesting. Maybe the game developers have some ideas, something more relevant.
Sorry, can you go over the phrasing of the question again?
Sure I was just thinking that how Acer was talking about that essentially what we see is our modern cartography projected onto these medieval maps. And medieval maps did more than that. They had time and narration on them. Like if you think about the really large, well-known one, for example, where you can follow the Bible. Are there games that can do that in modern ways with zooming or toggling or?
I think that there are certainly games that can do that. I don't think there are many that do. I think one thing that's it's important to recognize with a sort of game system is that you're like, one of the things about building a secondary world in a game, or indeed anywhere else, is that the amount of time you have to get it across to people is so infinitesimally small compared to the amount of time you have to get across, the actual world that you spend, tens of years of your life living in. So, and that makes it, and that's one of the reasons why things like maps keep pulling through again and again and again. Because you're not just, and that's not a vulnerability or something that the player is doing badly. It's just that you can't expect a player to build their mental map of the secondary world at anything like the speed you need them to actually experience the narrative or interesting bits of your game. So I think that is just an enormous factor in why games keep coming back to relatively conventional map styles. I guess the games that tend to have less directly accurate maps tend to be the sorts of games where you are kind of bouncing, where almost you're using the map more. That said, because if you've just if all you're going to is cities in a game, and you're not trying to build any of the surrounding countryside, that's just not part of the game, then actually it's easier to not have to worry about the map too much, because you can bounce from point A to point B. Or like a game that does a lot of travel, for example, like where you theoretically could have a map, but it doesn't, like completely outside medievalism. But if you look at, for example, Shadowrun Dragonfall, which is set in futuristic like anarchist Berlin. You move around the map of Berlin a lot, but there is no map. The reason there can be no map is that you're using the subway system all the time. Like you go in and you pop out in the next place. And in some ways that always gets you to like, that almost does loop back to some of these like medieval conceptions in some ways, in that like the process you're going through is based around this travel process. It's not based around, I have this conception of space. You know, it's we're taking the ship along the coast. No, we're taking the subway line to this place on the other side of the city. But yeah, there is, I guess, a connection there. So yeah, I think that's sort of my take on part of the map issue, is though that you have to do something to allow the player to cover for the fact that they can't know everything about this secondary world you've built.
Thank you very much. I think that was an excellent commenter on our first question as well. And I think also Mohammed's paper as well, because essentially that's an educational undertaking about a completely lost world. So I'm sure he has some fascinating insights of the limitations and the challenges of this process of simplifying something into an understandable but accurate presentation. We have a hand up, Paul.
Yes, thank you. Thank you also for the great presentations. I enjoyed really all of them. So my first question goes to Acer, because in the historical discipline nowadays, often historians try to rather focus on seas and oceans instead of continents, on territories, because they say through this measure you can sap imperial narratives, because you don't focus actually on territories. You're not trying to conquer territories to say this territory belongs to such and such, but you focus on the sea, and the sea has a much more dynamical way of mobility and of development. So I was wondering if you think that would work as well for computer games, or if you know any computer games that are already doing that. And this brings me to my second question for Mohammed, actually, because as we saw, the sea, of course, is a huge part of your map and probably also of your game. So I was wondering how you will include, or how you're including this aspect of maritime trade, maritime warfare into your game. And then third question, if I may, to James, is the sea, to stick to the trope, also part of your game, or is it just focused on countries and cities, as you said? Oh, thank you.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea to bring in. So yeah, the question, I guess, is how do we conceive of space and sea? And so I think you're referring to, I can't remember the name of the book, but there's an emerging area of Ottoman studies that focuses, or Eastern Mediterranean studies that focuses on interactions in the Mediterranean, because it's a way to sort of locate yourself in an inter-imperial zone where people are inter-imperial, actions are inter-imperial, and so you can find lots of rogues and pirates and fun characters to talk about. It is a very interesting area. I mean, the reason I talk about landscape is because landscape has a cultural attachment, that because we exist in a landscape, most of us don't exist on a sea. Perhaps someone could exist on the sea and they could have a cultural attachment to that sea. I'm not sure. But the way you talk about that, or the way you need to build that world changes, or at least a social world, because in this terrestrial world, we're all under states, we're all under empires, we all operate within sort of social and political rules or whatever. But when you shift to sea-based activities like piracy, for example, one of my friends wrote his his MA thesis about this. He was studying an Ottoman pirate, and the awareness that I had from listening to him talk about this is that it's not about political relationships as much as it is about a corporatistic formulation. Because if you're on the sea, you're on a boat, and if you're on a boat, somebody owns the boat, but nobody really owns one boat. I mean, unless you're very, very rich. Usually it's a corporate venture, especially in the pre-modern past. So it's a venture where you are gathering your money together, creating an organization, pillaging other people, and then benefiting your family back, your village back home. So you need to think about it in a different way. I'm not sure how you would portray that in regards to mapping. The other part of your question was games that portray that. There are many. The first one that comes to mind is Sid Meier's Pirates. It's a game from my childhood. This is a classic pirate game, but I think there are probably many more. Yeah. Thanks.
Mohammed, are you here with us?
Yes.
Yes. I think part of Paul's question was to you. Would you like to respond to that now?
Can you repeat again your question, because there are many voices around there. They are raining now.
All right. Sorry to hear that. So I was just wondering how you're trying to include the maritime aspect of empire building and of trade and of war into your game. So are there many ships, or how are you portraying the maritime aspect? Yeah, that's essentially it.
I see. Okay. So basically I see the metric aspect. I see the trading at their time from like a sea trade. In 7th century, I see they are trading lot of trading within China and India in Indonesia archipelago. So I see they are important cities. So when I see the proceeding in the seminar Srivijaya, I lot read, oh, this is land have like a Jambi and Palembang, or in Java they are important port. So I use a trading, so the ship will come here. But in new update, I mostly use a trading system, not with a ship system. So the ship not appears in the map. Well, but in system they are already at sea trading with a line. It's like in Palembang to another regions. The line will connecting with how higher the port level is. So I think this is my answer.
Thank you, Mohammed. James?
Yeah, how is the sea used in my game? Yes, the sea absolutely is part of my game. It's got this, I mean, as I mentioned, random map generation system, and that absolutely can and does include sort of sea sections and sea tiles, which can sometimes end up forming big lakes rather than seas because randomization. But so the ways that affects the game, I mean, the player can get ships and you need them to move across the sea. There are some sort of oddities that I've had to kind of do as workarounds, like the fact that you can basically walk up to any coastline in the game, and if you wait long enough, you can hail a ship, because otherwise, you know, the code does not have a very good way of ensuring that there are definitely ports everywhere you need them. So there are some oddities I've had to do as workarounds like that, but the sea I quite like, partly just for the aesthetic but also social aspect you get. So one like underlying system that doesn't get a lot of use but it is there is that I do actually model some of the trade systems in the world. When the map's generated, different areas of the map have different forms of production. That's different if it's a, you know, port city, then you actually might get it producing, you know, pearls, fish, sea silk, various these other things. So, and you'll notice that when you're asked to do sort of, you know, early game trading missions and so on to protect cargo. And there are also other kind of minor social features that can be triggered. So, for example, one thing that I have really enjoyed doing right through this is writing bits of sort of songs and music and poetry for this sort of secondary world. And there is one song that like only plays if you happen to be in a tavern that is in a port district of a city, because it's, you know, a sort of in-world sea shanty about a Blemmy who became a pirate. So there's and so yeah, I it is part of the game, and I'm sort of trying to play around with some of the, yeah, again, I guess in theming with the other stuff I was saying earlier, some of the social aspects of how that affects the kind of game world around it in various ways.
Thank you so much for the responses, and I think we can go on with Tess Watterson's question, and then maybe look at some of the questions in the chat. Tess?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think. Okay, cool. Thank you all so much for your papers. I actually kind of what I was going to ask about sort of builds on what James was just talking about. I was curious listening to what you mentioned in your paper about the kind of procedural generation of the landscape, James, and how that maybe connects with what Acer, you were talking about with these kind of challenges of these fixed landscapes and how we visualize those spaces. So I was just wondering if you could comment on how procedurally generated landscapes and games that kind of randomly generate encounters in the landscape, how that kind of interacts with that problem of the sort of fixed map space that we look at as a player, if that makes sense for either of you.
I've had a dream since I was a kid of a game that would be like a Cossack Russia Siberia colonization kind of thing, where you were sent out into the wilderness and you sort of build a village. But procedural generation would be wonderful for that. I think the key feature, and I'm reminded of Minecraft, which is procedurally generated, but it's also not maps, or not, the maps are not the most important part. And the only point that I would make, the only objection maybe, would be that you can create attachments with procedural generation. My point is about the attachments that you make, and how I think James described it as how you encounter the landscape and how you build memories around that. But the point is that when you depict the world in a flat way, procedural generated or not, it results in a certain approach.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and certainly in the way that I build my maps, the cities are very much the sort of fixed points and contested points in the map. So like it makes it a bit different to a game where you are literally sort of painting the map, and that sort of implies a lot more about control of surrounding space and possibly arbitrary control. So I guess there is a difference between that sort of total war style, like everything is in a province, everything is part of the contest points, and a sort of city-driven thing like this, or perhaps like Mount and Blade, where the control is of points on a map. And I think, but it sort of shifts the problem but doesn't entirely remove it, certainly. I think, yeah, the other thing is that the randomization of what you find in the map, for me, is very important in trying to, not make it a completely static experience and give people some amount of idea that they're supposed to be going through particularly with a game like mine, which is quite, it's quite cut down. You're not getting the I am embodying a little character to walking around beautiful lush fields. It's very easy to kind of lose a lot of the sort of interesting stuff about landscapes, and the landscapes having quite a big element of I actually don't know what I will find here. I think is quite an important, for me, and from the development process, that was quite an important sort of counterbalance on that. In that you can sort of find travelers, villages, farmsteads, which you can interact with in various ways, which are quite important, features of how you progress through the game.
Well, thank you for these responses. Do we have any other questions from the audience?
But mine mostly in the chat box as we went along.
Yes, I was just reading through. Thank you. I was hesitant to call on you, Francis, because there were so many other things. Would you like to summarize just a couple of points there? If we still have time, Juan?
What I find fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can spare
Reading
maybe
the
some
three,
2 minutes. Yeah.
the role of maps.
Yeah.
And then I'll leave that, just a little comment I was making on that. I'll have to look at that. Thank you. I like that response there. Thanks. I don't want to lose it, so I have to ask you to send it back to me.
Sure.
Anyhow, no, I found it interesting because, in fact, at one end with she shows us a map almost without thinking about it, as just as a useful piece of information just to tell us where we are, type thing. And then NASA also calls that very practice into question, and I find that interesting in its own right. I found the way that how cartography literally does, in fact, reduce the world to a collection of labels. In fact, and I found that was, and it's fun to see how it goes. There were other themes, other strands that I put in, and like the battle chickens I talked to the James Bailie, but I mean, I found it was an interesting piece. I thought the idea of maps were interesting. I also made one point that I thought was interesting, that when you were talking about when you're traveling, stellar cartography is going to be much more important, because stellar cartography gives you a way of knowing where you are without getting just by looking at the stars and knowing how they were. And remember, when unfortunately we can't turn off the lights on the planet anymore, but when they're turned off, there are a lot of stars out there, and you can pick out patterns, which I find interesting. Voila. Well, I'll wait for the next one.
Thank you very much for that. I think there's more consideration, more and more considerations for the coders and the map makers of games when they have to actually strive to make it simpler and more understandable. So it is a big, it's quite a big task. I think our time is kind of up, but as we have this networking platform as well, I think you can carry on with the conversation.
Yeah, I was going to say that as James mentioned, we also have the Topia space as the space between the sessions. I also have several questions that I didn't have the time to, so I hope that I'll be able to ask you my questions there. Please remember that our next panel is going to take place in 20 minutes. It's called Gaming the Middle Ages, continuing with the video game topic, now not from the developers, but from the playing perspective. And we hope to see you all there. Thank you again to our panelists. This was a very interesting topic, and we'll see you in a couple of minutes. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.